This show may contain adult language and themes. Listener discretion is advised. With that out of the way, let's start the show. You're listening to the Murder Is My Sign podcast, the only true crime astrology podcast, and I'm your host, Jordy Death, here to let you wade through the true crime astrology storm. Welcome to part 3 of Ken and Barbie Killer Couple. It's been an interesting ride so far up in Canada as we uncover the crimes of Paul, Bernardo, and Karla Homolka. We left off in part 2 with Karla finally getting away from Paul after he beat her so badly that she needed to go to the hospital. She was now staying at her aunt and uncle's place, and the police had just stopped by to ask her some questions. When they had left, they had informed her that they were close to arresting Paul in relation to the Scarborough rapist case. When Karla's aunt asked more questions after the police left, Karla admitted that Paul had also killed Leslie Mahaffey. The next day, Karla got an attorney, George Walker, and confessed to her part in the schoolgirl killings. Right before all this broke apart, Paul and Karla had petitioned to have their names changed, and they were approved on February 13th, 1993. Karla now went by Lene Teal, and Paul was Paul Jason Teal. For the purpose of the rest of the episode, I'll just continue to refer to them as Paul and Karla. I just wanted to make it a very brief footnote for those of you who might be interested. Paul was arrested on February 17th, 1993, on suspicion of being the Scarborough rapist, as well as a schoolgirl killer. A week later, Karla was able to strike a deal with the Crown Prosecution Service. If she pled guilty to manslaughter, she would do 12 years in prison for the 2 murders in exchange for her cooperation with testifying against Paul. She would also have a very brief trial and with good behavior would be eligible for parole in 3 years. During this time, a search warrant was issued to the local authorities working on the case to search Bernardo's house. But it was to find evidence in regards to the rapes, because at the time, his link to the murders was very weak, which meant that the search warrant was very limited. This meant that no evidence that was not expected to be found could be removed from the house, and any videotapes that were found had to be viewed inside the house, and the police could not tear down walls looking for the tapes. The search lasted 71 days until the warrants expired, in which the police were only able to find a video that showed Karla performing oral sex on Jane Doe. On May 6th, Paul's lawyer, Ken Murray, entered the house and after getting a phone call from Paul, removed the tapes that depicted the rapes of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, as well as 2 other girls. Murray and the other defense lawyer, Carolyn McDonald, decided to hold on to the tapes and use them to impeach Karla on the stand during Paul's trial. Not sure where Paul got these lawyers, but they're so flippin' inexperienced with criminal law, they were actually withholding evidence, which is not only a huge ethical issue, but also very criminal. What a bunch of schmucks. A publication ban was put into place on July 5th, 1993. This was an attempt to make sure that Paul had a fair trial, but because Karla had originally been portrayed as one of his many victims, Paul's lawyers thought that he would have prejudice by the ban and did not support it. Well, because this was in the early 90s and the internet was just a baby, the ban was pretty much nullified when people began posting articles online. Also, the ban could only be upheld in Canada, not the United States. So the US could write and publish whatever the fuck they wanted, within journalistic reason, of course. So towns that were right on the border of Canada and the United States had an easier time obtaining information about what was happening in the Bernardo Homolka case. It got to the point where copies of American newspapers were confiscated at the border. There were bootleg copies of the Buffalo Evening News, and people who had more than one copy were arrested. What a goddamn shit show circus. And you know what? Truthfully, it really just only gets worse. Having struck the plea bargain, Karla was tried on June 28, 1993. And because of the publication ban, limited details of the trial and hearing were released, and the public was banned from the proceedings. On July 6, 1993, Karla Homolka pled guilty to the 2 counts of manslaughter of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. The court also heard evidence surrounding Karla's criminal liability in regards to her sister Tammy's death. So that ended Karla's trial, and she was sentenced to 12 years. Now, the shit show surrounding Paul Bernardo was just warming up. In February 1994, Paul and Karla divorced. I guess those who kill together just don't stay together. Also, Karla was about to testify against Paul, as she promised to do, to get her reduced sentence. So, that probably would have put a strain on the relationship, also with the abuse, the torture, the rape, and the murder. I don't know. You tell me. Remember Paul's incompetent lawyer, Ken Murray, though? Well, during the summer of 1994, he was having second thoughts in regards to the ethical conundrum in withholding the videotapes and representing Paul Bernardo. So Murray consulted his own lawyer, Austin Cooper, who in turn asked the Law Society of Upper Canada for their advice. The following is a quote from the Wikipedia page of Karla Homolka in regards to what the Law Society directed. The statement was originally released through Cooper in September of 1995, after being dictated by Ken Murray. Quote, "The Law Society directed Murray in writing to seal the tapes in a package and turn them over to the judge presiding at Bernardo's trial. The Law Society further directed him to remove himself as Bernardo's counsel and to tell Bernardo what he had been instructed to do." End quote. John Rawson was the lawyer who replaced Murray, and during Paul's trial on September 12, 1994, Cooper advised Justice Patrick Lesage and the prosecutors about what the Law Society of Upper Canada had directed Ken Murray to do. Rosen argued that the tapes should have been handed over to the defense first, but when Murray finally handed the tapes over along with a detailed summary to Rosen, he, quote, "kept the tapes for about 2 weeks and then decided to turn them over to the prosecution." End quote. Tapes. Who's got the tapes? I mean, Jesus Christ, was this their first fucking trial? Like, seriously, it's ridiculous. Murray faced a disciplinary hearing from the Law Society, but was later acquitted from obstruction of justice because, it's Canada. And as much as I rag on Canada, I mean, they're pretty lenient, I think, on some things. But, whatever. Blame Canada.
Blame Canada! Blame Canada!
Always looking for an excuse to use those sound bites. So the videotapes were given over to the court, and then later in December of 2001, many, many years after the trial, when the Canadian authorities determined that there was no possible future use for the tapes, they were destroyed. So, anyway, going back in time a little bit, Paul Bernardo's trial began on May 18th, 1995. But once word got out that the videotapes had been withheld from the police for so long, the public damn near lost their minds. Y'all gonna make me lose my mind. Up in here, up in here. I love these pop culture references, and I hope you guys out there listening enjoy them just as much as I do. Rumors began to spread that Karla was an active and willing participant to the schoolgirl killings, and the public became enraged, but because of Karla's plea bargain, she had already disclosed sufficient information to the police that there were no grounds for the Crown to break the agreement and reopen the case and retry her. So she got a really sweet fucking deal. On June 29th, 1995, Karla testified against Paul. Random little side thought or note here, and this is in regards to the books I've been using. In the book The Most Evil Women in History by Shelley Klein, it's a bit of a hot mess. Now, I know I've been using this book a lot throughout the series on Paul and Karla, but I cannot help but point out that this book was originally published in Great Britain in 2003 by Michael O'Mara Books Limited, and the edition that I own was published by Barnes & Noble by arrangement with Michael O'Mara. So basically, when the book was republished in America, using an American publisher. And it's pretty clear, just by me reading the chapter that they have on Karla Homolka, that they did not have a proofreader or perhaps even a fact checker, which calls into question the validity of the source itself. The same can be said for the Deadly Duos book by Paul Rowland that I have, another book that was originally published in London in 2010 through Arcturus Publishing Limited, and then republished by Chartwell Books Incorporated, which is a division of Book Sales Incorporated located in New York. In both books, they make allusions that Karla and Paul were American, or that Canada celebrates Independence Day on the 4th of July. For example, in the Deadly Duos book, it begins the chapter on the Ken and Barbie killer by saying, quote, "Their blonde, blue-eyed good looks and had earned them the names Ken and Barbie because of their resemblance to the children's dolls of the same name. But their smiles hid the dark souls of two of America's most depraved and sadistic sex killers." End quote. I mean, do they mean North America? Because America is definitely not Canada. And Paul and Karla were very much Canadian citizens. I mean, we have enough serial killers here in America. We don't need to be adding, these two fuckers to the list, is all I'm saying. And the book goes on to say that they raped and terrorized the women in the suburbs of Toronto, Canada. So I just don't understand the inconsistency. I really just don't get it. And then with the Most Evil Women in History book, it says that on Independence Day, 4th of July, 1995, John Rosen began questioning Karla by slamming 2 photos of her sister Tammy down in front of her. I mean, why would the author qualify that date by saying it was Independence Day when Canada does not celebrate it? I mean, that's America. That's an American tradition. I mean, that would be like me saying that we celebrate Boxing Day here when we as Americans generally do not celebrate it. I mean, I get that I am and can be very ignorant American, I understand that. But Jesus Christ, at least when I'm talking about serial killers from other countries, I at least try to remain consistent with using the proper countries, holidays, or any other applicable information when talking about them. The inconsistencies of these books are staggering and appalling. So if you folks out there are ever, wishing to read these books, or perhaps any sources that were originally published in the United Kingdom, just take it with a giant grain of salt that they can't seem to stay consistent or true to the killers that they write about, especially if they're here in America. So, it's something, and especially as someone who works in a bookstore, this really freaking irritates me. Anywho, sorry for the little tirade there, but, just really grinds my gears when they can't even get basic facts right, thus nullifying them as credible sources, which, they're not even primary sources to begin with. I understand that. But, it's just inconsistent. You could have easily... Anyone who knows any basic geography knows that, yes, Canada is in North America, but it is above America, thus, which makes it better? I don't know. We won't get into that. This is not the podcast for that. Deep breaths, folks. Deep breaths. Okay. Getting back on track here. So Karla is now testifying against Paul, and John Rosen was going after her quite extensively by slamming photos down of the victims and questioning why she never went to the police. When she replied in the same fashion as before during her interrogation with the police and also during her trial, by stating she was terrified of what Paul might do to her, and Rosen wasn't buying it. He responded to the permanence of bullshit by stating that she did not confess to the police until after she was guaranteed a deal you could live with from January 1993, held on to her silence until she was looked after. Rosen was stating that what the public had been thinking once they learned of the videotape debacle. The reason why he was going after Karla so hard and poking holes in her lame excuses as to why she never went to the police was an attempt to paint her as the sexually dominant partner who enjoyed kinky sex and was the one who actually killed Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. Remember, his job was to defend Paul Bernardo, and he would do that at any way possible, at any cost. So Rosen was partly successful with his tactic, but failed to prove that it was actually Karla who committed the murders. Once she was done with questioning, she was transported back to her cell at the prison for women. When Paul took the stand against the advisement of his legal team, he said, unsurprisingly, that it was Karla's idea to drug Tammy, kill Leslie, and get married. Not in that order, though. Pretty much, it was a he said, she said type deal. The court found Bernardo guilty, though, on September 1st, 1995, on all charges against him, including the 2 first-degree murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. 2 weeks later, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years, which takes place this year in 2020. While Karla served her sentence, and during her time in prison, she obtained her bachelor's in psychology through Queen's University. She also began a sexual relationship with Linda Vranu, who was serving time for armed robbery, and actually reoffended when she got out so that way she could be sent back to Joliet Institution, where Karla was now being held. Vranu identified as a man and was scheduled to undergo gender reassignment surgery. And Vranu stated that Karla liked to be tied up. And one game seemed to simulate rape. So it's very interesting that she mentioned this because it begins to paint a better picture of what kind of deviant Karla truly was and is. I mean, she's still alive. When Karla underwent a psychiatric evaluation in 2000, she told the psychiatrist that she did not believe that her relationship with Vranu was homosexual because Vranu saw herself as a man and planned to undergo surgery. In the report, it's noted that Karla was ashamed of the relationship and hid it from her parents and the experts who examined her. But the psychiatrist mentioned that under the circumstances, the relationship was not abnormal. And honestly, it's like one of those things where just because you... It's really complicated sometimes. I'm not really going to get into it, but I can understand where she's coming from, because if Vranu identified as a man and preferred the male pronouns, it really doesn't necessarily make her, Karla, a lesbian for being with him, Vranu. I want to be very respectful. I'm not doing a very good job of explaining it, but I hope you guys can kind of understand why she would think that, but then also why it's really not that big of a deal. Karla transferred to a different prison in Quebec and began a sexual relationship with a convicted murderer who was being held in the men's unit at the facility. And in December of 2001, Karla broke up with Linda. It boiled down to she was only staying with Linda long enough so that way she could get her computer and some clothing back from her. So, just another tally for how wonderful Karla is as a person, I suppose. In the summer of 2005, Karla was released from prison after serving her 12-year sentence, and was given several restrictions on her freedom, including she had to tell the police her home address, work address, and whom she was living with. She was required to notify the police as soon as any of those changed. She was likewise required to notify the police of any change to her name, and if she planned to be away from her home for more than 48 hours, she had to give 72-hour notice. She could not contact Paul, the families of Leslie and Kristen, or of the woman known as Jane Doe, or any violent criminals for that matter, and she was forbidden to be with people under the age of 16. She was also forbidden from consuming drugs other than prescription, and she was required to continue therapy and counseling, and also required to provide police with a DNA sample. The DNA sample was in part of a new bill that had just recently been passed that required all violent criminals to submit a sample that would be held in a national databank. Now that Karla was out of prison, she ended up getting a job at a hardware store, but her boss revealed her location to the press and she ended up quitting and going back into hiding. In November of 2005, a Montreal judge overturned the 14 conditions that were imposed on Karla when she was released from prison in July, saying that there was not enough evidence to justify them. In 2006, Karla had requested to have her name changed yet again to Emily Chiara Tremblay. Tremblay was and still is a very common surname in Quebec. But this request was rejected. Karla had decided to live in Quebec because she found it to be more accepting than Ontario, mainly because of the primary language in Quebec that is spoken is French. And the French don't give a fuck. At least that is what I have observed. In 2007, Karla moved to Guadalupe, where she married Thierry Bordalis, and they ended up having 3 kids. And she was now living under her new name of Leanne Bordalis. And later that year, Paul, while in prison, met with police to discuss the 1990 disappearance of Elizabeth Bain, who was presumed dead. Elizabeth Bain's boyfriend at the time, Robert Boltovich, had been wrongly convicted and served 8 years in prison before he was released and found not guilty. And as of this recording, however, no one has been convicted in her murder, not even Paul Bernardo. Another person who had been falsely accused of a crime that was actually committed by Paul was Anthony Hainmayer, who was later acquitted by Ontario's top court. And it's just kind of weird reading about, like, these 2 individuals who were wrongly convicted, and especially with this happening in Canada. Like, you would think that America would make those false imprisonments and, like, really fuck up like that, but the fact that this was Canada seems very surprising. Like, I understand, mistakes happen, but Jesus Christ, like, that's pretty freaking crazy. And as if the story couldn't get any more convoluted or crazy, in 2007, a rumor began circulating that Luca Magnotta was dating Karla Homolka, a rumor that he denied, and yet had started himself for the attention. And if you guys have Netflix, you may be familiar with the name of Luca Magnotta from the Netflix documentary series Don't Fuck with Cats, which came out in late 2019. Now, to be honest, I have not watched the series yet, but came across this fact while doing my research on Karla Homolka. Apparently, in 2014, Karla's sister Logan Valentini, formerly Lori Homolka, was linked to the Luca Magnotta trial when he mailed body parts of his victim, Jun Lin, to various places in Canada, one of which being the elementary school that she worked at, being addressed to her, Valentini. Actually, I don't know if she actually worked at that elementary school, but the package, from what I read in the article, was mailed to the elementary school, and then it had Valentini's return address on it. And so she, of course, had nothing to do with this, but the link between those two is just kind of unnerving and just really freaking, like, small world and weird. It was also during this time in 2014 that Valentini confirmed that her sister was now back in Canada. Paul Bernardo, on the other hand, is still very much locked up in prison and having been denied parole in 2018, and I very highly doubt he will be given parole in 2020. There is a news article that came out in 2018 for the National Post that says that Bernardo, quote, cries all the time, end quote, and blames his low self-esteem for his actions. It's incredibly unlikely that he will ever be released from prison, but who knows, crazier things have happened, and as we've already covered in the series, especially when it comes to Canada, apparently. And I thought we were the crazy ones here in America. Well, I think it's about that time that we get to the astrological bit of things, don't you? So, starting off, Paul Bernardo was born on August 27th, 1964 in Scarborough, Ontario, Canada, which makes him a Virgo. And Miss Karla was born on May 4th, 1970 in Port Credit, Ontario, Canada, which makes her a Taurus. What happens when the virgin fucks around with the bull, or the bull fucks the virgin? Ooh, phrasing. Well, let's talk about that. Traditionally, Virgo and Taurans do very well together. Both are earth signs. The interesting thing with Karla's chart is that her sun, moon, and Mercury signs are all in the sign of Taurus. She actually has no fire signs at all in her chart and is heavily weighted with 5 earth signs, 4 air signs, and only 1 water sign, which would make Karla a very stubborn and calculating person with really the emotional depth of a Dixie cup, I would imagine. On the flip side of things, Paul has a Virgo sun, Aries moon, and Virgo and Mercury's in Virgo. Both Karla and Paul have Mercury in retrograde within their charts, which, by the way, folks, we have just entered the first run of Mercury retrograde this year, so gird your loins and may the odds be ever in your favor. Paul, like Karla, has a whopping 5 earth signs, but 0 air signs, and only 1 fire sign and 4 water signs in his chart. And he has a staggering 9 feminine signs as well, something that I thought was interesting. The only other planet that was in retrograde at the time of his birth was Saturn in the sign of Pisces. Karla, however, has Jupiter, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, as well as Mercury, all in retrograde. As I mentioned, traditionally, Taurus and Virgos are very compatible. According to the Astro Twins book, if you're a Taurus and he's a Virgo, he thinks you're sexy, sophisticated mate who makes him look good in person, and you think he's compatibly cultured, but a little cheap. And your common language is food, wine, highbrow or fussy tastes, culture, budgets, bondage, rough sex, rape, and murder. Oh wait, I don't think those last 4 were actually in the book. Whoopsies. In the 365 Birthdays Interpreted book, the love compatibility chart for Virgo and Taurus is across the board very good, with the exception of spontaneity. Taurans are not spontaneous people. This really makes me laugh when I look at the Taurus love compatibility chart. The spontaneity row is completely blank across all 12 signs. I also noticed that Taurans and Aquarians are not compatible at all, according to that chart. So, for all my lovely Taurans out there listening, I'm sorry, but it'll never work. When I placed their charts together using the Cafe Astrology website, I found something interesting that stood out to me. Karla's sun is in a trine with Paul's Pluto. A trine is the most harmonious of the major aspects, and it brings advantage and ease. With this trine, it brings a love at first sight type of passion, and these two will be drawn to each other like magnets, with a very good sexual understanding of each other. It does note that this type of relationship may not last forever, and it may not develop into a quiet and tender love. If they should part, it will be close to impossible to stay friends because of the constant reminder of the passion they once had. When Paul and Karla met, it was a truly very magnetic attraction between the two, and they had quite the passionate sex life. unfortunately involved some pretty horrendous acts, and they had a very messy divorce. But I suppose that this is to be expected when you and your partner are both charged with rape, torture, and murder of young girls. Overall, though, their chart implicates that these two have a very strong connection to each other and will get along very well. However, it won't be without its obstacles, and should the union fall apart, it will be painful and messy, which is pretty much everything that we've covered over the course of the last 3 episodes, wouldn't you say? Well, I think that will do it for this series on the Ken and Barbie killers, Paul, Bernardo, and Karla Homolka. I want to thank you all so much for listening. Please be sure to share Murder is My Sign with anyone you can, any way that you can. You can find Murder is My Sign anywhere you download your favorite podcasts or on your favorite podcasting app. You can also support the show by joining the Boneyard at patreon.com/murderismysign. And from now until March 3rd, I am running a special offer for those who join at the Death Head level, which is $5 a month. When you join and you become a Death Head, you will receive a personalized thank you card in the mail, as well as the standard perks of having your name shouted out at the beginning of the next episode and early access to when I post the episodes. You can also become a Boneyard backer for just $1 a month and still get that shout out at the end of each episode for my undying gratitude. My goal is to build my community within Patreon, and so I've established goals for when we reach 10 patrons. I will create a special blooper reel, and at 15 patrons, I will make a special edition Murder's My Sign sticker and mail it out to all my patrons. And, the list goes on. You can all find it all at patreon.com/murdersmysign. So please consider joining and supporting the show, just like Jake, Holly, Michelle, and Crystal. I got 4 wonderful, beautiful patrons supporting me, and I just need 6 more to get to our first goal, which would be a lot of fun. So any help would be greatly appreciated. You can also help, like I said, by sharing the podcast, or even joining by following me on social media. If you're into that. You can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, all at Jordy Death. That's JORDY Death. Or you can also email the show directly at murderismysignpodcast@gmail.com. I just want to thank you guys again so much for listening, and I will catch you all next week with a surprise Side Slice episode. But until then, take care of yourself and each other, and rest in peace.